latest ongoing crazy battles that we see over just, well, trying to have a little bit of sanity. Nicola Sturgeon's provoked something of a backlash in Scotland and indeed elsewhere, particularly from feminist groups, after she refused to define the word woman, claiming that to do so would harm transgender people. Let's talk to Susan Smith. She's co-director of For Women Scotland, a group of Scottish women looking to strengthen women's rights. Good morning to you, Susan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us. Just tell us exactly what it is that Nicola Sturgeon had to say, because it was an interview with The Times in the run-up to Thursday's local elections happening across the country. The SNP is planning to allow Scottish people to change their legal sex simply by making a declaration. Just simply, I identify as the opposite sex, end of the matter. That's your legal status, full stop. She was asked to define, well, what is a woman? But she refused to do so.
Yes. And I think probably the reason for that is because Nicola Sturgeon does have a definition of women, but it's probably not one that you or I would actually agree with. And we know this because earlier this year, we took the Scottish Government to court and we won an appeal on the definition of woman in a piece of Scottish legislation, the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. And what they had tried to do was to define woman as anybody who says they're a woman. Yeah. And the examples that they used were changing your name on your driver's license, using pronouns, she, her pronouns. And it was very vague. They said you didn't have to have gone through any process. You didn't have to dress or present in a certain way. You just had to self-declare. And nobody even had to check. So during that process as well, what came out was the Scottish Government had a policy that nobody had heard of before, which said that they considered trans women to be women unless they were legally prohibited from treating them as such in law. So what's quite clear is that Nicola Sturgeon doesn't actually believe that women define a sex category. Yeah. And probably the reason she didn't want to say it is because she knows that most people think that's an absurdity.
But this is the thing. It has become the norm. And we've had, Keir Starmer, not being able to define things. We've had, Liberal Democrats. We've had a number of Tories. And we really had to push for Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak sort of failed to give me a definitive answer. I disagree with what the Prime Minister said yesterday when he was on my show a little while ago. It's amazing how hard it is for people to, it's a very simple definition. It's an adult human female. That's what it is. That is what a woman is. Now, we had that whole Stonewall campaign, trans women are women. And we've got a situation on social media. I mean, it depends, now Elon Musk is in charge of Twitter, maybe it's allowed. To even say trans women are not women is regarded as transphobic, as hateful, as divisive, as opposed to a simple statement of fact. The use of the word trans is short for transition, which means you've transitioned from being a man to a woman, which means you're not a woman because you're not an adult human female because you were born male. Now, there's no hate involved in that. There's no transphobia involved in that. You're not stirring up division. You're simply making statements. And this is where we get into this battle about sex and gender. And I think for most people, frankly, they're either having a nice late morning eating their breakfast, or was already at work, travelling to work, getting the kids after school in the morning. We do not spend most of our time wondering, is that your gender or your sex? It's really obvious. No one's ever needed to tell me what their personal pronouns are because I can see very clearly what they are. It's not a big issue for the vast majority of us. And yet this is something that our politicians have embroiled themselves in. And now they're coming up against the cold, hard reality of voters' actual sense and common sense. And voters don't like this madness.
No, they don't. And, what Sturgeon has been doing is she's refused to engage. She's said that our concerns aren't valid. She said that she's allowed ministers in her government, especially the Green ministers, to make all sorts of unpleasant insinuations about women like me and women like J.K. Rowling who are opposed to this. Mm-hmm. And she hasn't spoken out when members of her own party have been targeted by online mobs or indeed had credible threats made against them. So she's ignored all that. And now she's saying she's a feminist and that she fights sexism. But we've yet to see the evidence of that. And if she really was interested in fighting sexism, she'd actually want to listen to some of these things. Because we were saying this morning, we're seeing with what is happening in the US with the potential overturning of Roe versus Wade.
This is the abortion rights, yes.
Yeah. And women on the left who have been completely taken over by trans ideology are talking about rights for birthing bodies, which is an absurd and horrific and dehumanizing way to talk about women.
Yeah.
And it actually doesn't help, because if we think of women as just receptacles for babies, then it's actually easier to take those rights away.
Yeah, and this is the thing. It's the people who complain the most about, it's terrible sexism. We need women-only shortlists. We need, more women in Parliament. We've had this big Westminster sleaze row. And then you say, okay, well, define a woman. Well, a woman is anyone who says they're a woman. Oh, well, in that case, we could just have loads more men in Parliament who say they're women. I mean, all these people like Donald Trump, horrible sexist pig. I wish, before he left office, Donald Trump, instead of inciting riots, had actually said, I identify as a woman. And then he would have been, according to the Democrats, many of them, he would have been the first female president. Because if you say you're a woman, you are a woman. That's nonsense. I know that's nonsense. I think secretly deep down, people like Nicola Sturgeon and Keir Starmer and others who spout this nonsense claptrap, I think they know it's nonsense. I think they have exactly the same common sense, biologically fact-based views as everyone else in their private lives. And yet, who do they think they're appealing to when they make these public statements? That's the bit I don't get, because I don't think that a few thousand people on Twitter get to decide elections.
No, it's a very interesting one. I do worry about Sturgeon. I think probably you're right that Keir Starmer is well aware. I think Nicola Sturgeon has been very captured by this, and she is very determined, and I think she possibly sees this as her legacy, and she's determined to drive on with it. I don't think anything else would explain why she is so resistant to the idea of having a conversation, just a decent conversation about why there are violent men in Scottish women's prisons at the moment, why this horrific school guidance came in that said that girls couldn't object to teenage boys in the showers, and that children could be transitioned behind parents' back, and why she is refusing to address what's happening in the Sanderford Clinic, which is our gender clinic that deals with young people. And as opposed to what is happening with the Cass review now in England. She said she'll look at it, but she's also passed the buck this week in Parliament and said this is a matter of
But this is it. This was very much a very fringe conversation, and people use these terms like TERF. And you talk to most people, what's a TERF? A trans-exclusionary radical feminist, gender critical theory, all this stuff. It's pie in the sky and nonsense. Doesn't mean anything. But when you say to people, do you think that a man on a Thursday afternoon can say he's a woman and that makes him a woman? People look at you and laugh. They splutter into their pints and their cups of tea and say, you're insane. And that's not, those are not people who would in any way be abusive or disrespectful or unkind to someone who was genuinely living as a trans person. And I don't know anyone who feels that, who is among the people who were questioning this. But we have this across the board. It's not just this sort of esoteric, sort of theoretical, philosophical argument. It's happening in reality. You talked about, male prisoners being put into female prisons. We've had women who've been raped and sexually assaulted behind bars, where they are incredibly vulnerable. Most women, bearing in mind, behind bars, not for any violent assaults or anything. Vast majority of the men who identify as women behind bars in our prison system are men who've been convicted of sexual assault and rape, for goodness sake. What does that tell you? Now, that's not to say that trans people are abusers. It's to say that sexual abusers will use these laws aimed at protecting trans people and to use them to gain access to their prey. Can I ask you also about something that's happening? David Cameron, back with the Big Society, that's a long time ago, isn't it? He set up the National Citizen Service, and includes summer camps for 16 and 17-year-olds, and you go away for a week or two. Well, it turns out they've had a policy, which parents weren't informed about, that any boy at 16 or 17, and we know how in no way do hormones rule the 16 to 17-year-old boys of this world, that boys are being allowed to self-identify as girls and to be allowed to sleep in the girls' dormitory and to use the girls' showers and loos and changing rooms. Now, I'm sorry, I'm the mother of a 15-year-old girl. I don't bloody well think so.
No, and I think these organisations are potentially opening themselves up to really serious court cases at some point, because if a girl is assaulted and they've put a biological boy in there, they are going to be in trouble. It's one of the things that's really, really troubling about the Scottish proposals is that this idea that they're going to let children at the age of 16 change their legal sex. Because when we're talking about schools, at the moment schools and this youth organisation should be able to say, no, legal males, legal females, end off. But what the Scottish Government is proposing is that change is made at 16. And head teachers have said it's going to be harder to exclude those boys from girls' space if they've legally changed their sex. There's a lot in this. I mean, when you were talking about trans people, I think what we have to realise is the Scottish Government's proposals don't even mention trans people. They're not about trans people. They're about anybody. For any reason. And if they think that predators will not take advantage of something that is open to anybody for any reason,
they're crazy. I mean, they are crazy. That's the key thing. Thank you so much for joining us, Susan Smith. Really appreciate that. 9:55 at the time. Mike Graham is here.